Great. So, a separate few slides just to cover this point um, that was brought up before, and I think will be brought up definitely more times. Just like to use these few slides as a reference point, to refer to these few slides that summarize why we're not perfect in training our reactions. And basically, the key message here is that there are very many reasons why stimulus response training does not happen naturally, properly. Yes, the training of our neural network happens always. In most cases, it's unsupervised learning with a lot of noise, with and very unstructured, with small training samples. But let's go further in more details with some specific examples that prove why the stimulus response training doesn't happen properly. So common issues, right? So stimulus is being avoided. And let me just, read through the text and maybe I will add a few additional points because this is, I think, really summarizes well and brings good examples. So avoiding social situations to learn how to feel comfortable in them. I mean, a person who wants to train the response to a stimulus called social situations of a specific type um, avoids these situations and therefore cannot train the response that it wants to train. So stimulus happens rarely in natural conditions. Another great example, public speaking opportunities, they don't happen often enough to train presentation skills. And if a person wants to train the response to public speaking, it must design some social situation where situations where the person can train these responses, and it creates additional costs to that kind of training. And yes, there are alternatives and options, for example, the visualization techniques and so on. But still, the reality is stimulus happens rarely in natural conditions, and therefore the trainee does not have enough opportunities to train the response it wants to train. So the trainee has to create such opportunities. Frequency of stimulus response repetition is low. Opportunities to enter situation are low and opportunities to design and repeat the situation are limited. So an example is a social conflict situation. When like it's okay to enter situations with the public speaking opportunities, right? Toastmasters club and so on. But what if a person wants to train its reaction in a situation of a big you know, of situation when the person is in the middle of the crowd and the crowd is panicking. These are not the kind of situations someone would have an easy way to create. So frequency of these situations of the stimuli are low, and therefore repetition is not easy to do. Stimulus is hard to get to set up, to exercise the response. And I think that's a bit similar to the previous one. So training leadership skills in a group conflict requires team to simulate such conflict, right? Group conflict. Also not possible. Stimulus is hard to tailor to the level needed for training. Amazing example, really like it because this like the the exposure therapy is it has like different forms, but one is like basically big bang exposure, right, to the stimuli at its maximum, or another option is step by step, slowly increasing the level of stimulation by the stimulus and uh, slowly getting adjusted to the stimulus that for which the response should be updated. But it requires a lot of tailoring, right? And not all kind of situations can be tailored. If we're talking about the agoraphobia or any kind of phobia, potentially there is a way to design the training process in a way that the participant, the trainee, is slowly approaching the stimuli and the level of irritation and stimulation increases, right? So either it's a picture of a dog, or it's a dog on a TV screen, or it's a dog in a box, or it's a dog on the street, or it's a dog or on basically, or it's touching a dog. But that's not possible for all kinds of stimulus and response pairs. Um, Stimulus repeat. And another good example is exams, right? So exams are rare. It's one of the type events and conflict situations spiral up to too fast. Type of here, too fast. Actually, no, too fast to update the stimulus response pair. Another example, like stimulus repetition is costly and time consuming, right? Money and time are required for driving lessons. If someone wants to train um, the response to the road situations, I mean, you need driving lessons. And for sure, even if you do 20 hours of driving lessons, there will be specific situations that didn't happen during these lessons or happened just once. So very costly and time consuming to replicate these situations. Stimulus is not clearly defined or well known. Amazing point, unclear what exactly triggers state of mind or particular energy level or particular response. It's not clear what triggers the response, and therefore you cannot properly train that response and adjust it. Um, that would be, very famous, good example that I like a lot, right? If you there is a boxer and the competitor is wearing red shorts during the match, and I receive a knockout from the competitor in red shorts, it will be unclear what exactly triggered. I mean, so what exactly to what which factor I got the response connected, which is response of flight, and only with some equipment even and some other diagnostics it will be possible to identify which specific stimuli got connected to the reaction of flight from the event. So similar but wrong stimulus is being trained. Exactly the point earlier, right? But here the example is that the stimulus is already wrongly identified. So getting used to the car driving instructor does not help when driving another car during the exam. Perfect example. You of course get used to the pedals and the power of the car, the torque, and if you get completely different car, you can even stall the car during the exam just because you're not used to that specific other car, and your reactions are not universal. You're not listening the engine. You just get used to the level of pressure you apply to the pedal. So imagining the situation in a quiet, relaxed state is different from the real arousal situation stimulus, right? To the real situation, and training your responses to a stimuli that happens in a quiet, basically condition is not the same as training your response to the same stimuli when it happens in a very loud, crowded place with a lot additional peer pressure and team pressure and so on. Wrong stimuli are prioritized and trained. This is such a great point. I really like it. Person prioritizes learning English while the same person would agree another focus would be more impactful. So there's no proper end-to-end prioritization. And while yes, we you know tend to download apps and habit building apps and train some habits, the first step, which is identification of really most important stimuli to be stimulus stimulus response pairs, identification did not happen. So the proper identification of the right stimulus response pairs did not happen and does not happen very often. Therefore, wrong stimuli are prioritized and trained. Wrong level of stimulus in sequence being trained. Person chooses to learn English words instead of training to load right emotional state prior to English word training. Um, if the English language learning process constantly activates the role of a helpless child, and then doesn't matter how many times the cards will be repeated, and doesn't matter how often they are trained, and even the response is correct, so even if the cards are learned, 500 cards of English words learned, if still the response on the level of the role was not trained first, then all these cards will be forgotten and there will be no proper effect. There will be no effect that the person expects. Desired response is not clearly defined. The person enters thinking mode, choosing response from multiple options each time. The response should be clearly defined, and as well as the speed of response, the balance between the thinking process and automatic reaction, and so on. Wrong response is being trained by reading books on a personal change topics and all these personal development topics. The stimulus triggers contemplation thinking mode instead of triggering special action. So, common condition, the wrong response is being trained. The person is reading some books on a topic that is important for the person to adjust. Let's say a person has an issue with writing long texts. So you can download or read tons of manuals, YouTube videos, courses on the topic, but that would be not a training of the response to a stimuli or stimulus, which is just sitting in front of the computer and writing a long text. The triggering that happens is contemplation mode, thinking mode, exploratory mode. Okay, let me explore what should be done next. Let me consider different approaches that can be leveraged here to address this concern I have. But the result is that all these responses are not the responses that the person really wants to train, and what really the person really wants to train is sitting in front of the computer, having the task, and just executing the task. Wrong level of response strength is trained. All behavior building tools focus on performing the response level, skipping repetition of visualizing the response. So um, yes, the point here, as with exposure therapy, we have different power of the stimuli, but also the response that can have different powers. So one level is when you just visualize the response. Okay, I visualize this action. And another level of strength is when actually this action is not just visualized but actually executed. So very often, as I can see, we start with training um, the the later stage, the response, let's say the action instead of the visualization, instead of defining very well and visualizing the response of different aspects, just behaviors being trained. Response is not evaluated as right or wrong, so there's no feedback loop. Even after doing the right thing, the feedback loop is not provided. Right action stays unnoticed. Correct response is not rewarded. Yeah, so basically, if there's no feedback loop, then the cycle is not closed and the response will not stick if the right response does not get also the feedback it should receive. So the feedback loop, reward or punishment, is not connected to the response. Feeling psychologically good after training is realized, but does not create craving for training. When steering an oil tanker, stimulus, info from the GPS and response turning, but it takes 20 minutes to see the result of the action. Hard to learn how much wheel rotation is needed. Okay, the main point here, right, is that very often the feedback loop is connected to the wrong part of the response. When you put together a puzzle, the feedback loop should be addressing the speed of your tries. And if you try many puzzles per minute, your feedback loop should be telling you you're doing great, you're doing the right things. However, if the feedback loop is evaluating the successful matches, then it's a wrongly connected feedback loop because this is not what should receive positive reinforcement, not the success, but the effort in this specific example with a puzzle and many other examples like this when the feedback loop is not connected to the response that you actually want to train. It connects to something else that looks very, very similar from higher level view, but um, when we go into the further details, we realize that no, this is the feed, the reinforcement is connected to the wrong aspect of the behavior.